Welcome back, everybody. This is Winning the H2O Debates podcast series for high school students on the high school topics. I'm Brian DeLong, the Director of Debate at Indiana University, and I am excited to welcome Dr. Zirogiannis, that, for purpose of the podcast, I will call Nikos, which is his first name. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm very excited to be here with you today.
You are an expert in a lot of areas when it comes to environmental related issues in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs here at Indiana University. And I believe that you teach a class that focuses in on water related issues. Is that correct?
Correct. The class is called Water Policy and Economics. So we approach in that class the field of water policy from the vantage point of economics. We talk about things like benefit cost analysis, like how state and federal water rules are being crafted. And in general, how does the government go about regulating water resources?
So I don't know if you can provide us maybe with a few examples of some of the learning outcomes. What do you seek to teach? I believe it's graduate students that are taking this, correct?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So we talk a lot in this class about what is called in the field policy instruments, right? These are different types of policies that the state or federal government uses to regulate water, right? So for example, one example of a policy instrument is a type of an incentive instrument, right? Which we call, let's think about subsidies for farmers to invest in efficient irrigation systems, right? So there are states where we are concerned about issues like water scarcity, right? There isn't enough water available, so we want to make sure that whatever water we're using it in a very efficient way, right? So oftentimes state governments or the federal government incentivizes farmers to adopt water efficient irrigation systems so that they do not waste water. And to do that, they offer subsidies to help farmers purchase those efficient irrigation systems. Now, this sounds like a good idea, right? Let's help farmers become more efficient. Well, there's a catch here. And the catch is that by providing this incentive, so long as you do not limit the total amount of water that farmers can use, you can have the counterintuitive and the sort of the negative result of offering those subsidies and farmers taking advantage of those subsidies to such an extent that they actually increase the total amount of water they use, right? Because now they are more efficient in the amount of the water per acre that they use, they start expanding agricultural land, or they start planting crops that are more water intensive. So we have cases where subsidies for irrigation efficient technologies have actually increased total amounts of water used. Right? So these are some of the things we talk about in this class, right? So sometimes policies might sound like good ideas, but we have to think very, very hard and very carefully about the unintended consequences that policies might have.
So I think the examples that you provide are exactly what a lot of high school students and coaches and camp directors are looking for to help students think through. Sometimes policies sound good because I think that it'll be very easy on this topic to find problems that are happening with our water resources in the United States. But it's really the devil being in the details in the type of policy that is provided as the solution. So you've just identified what sounds to me like a positive incentive through financial either subsidies, tax payments, or tax reductions as a means of protecting the environment. Are there other examples of types of incentives or policies that you can think through that have those type of counterintuitive implications?
I guess I can speak on the lack of policies, right? So one of the main problems we're dealing with in the US, at least from the perspective of water quality regulations, is the fact that for many years, agriculture has gone unregulated from the perspective of pollution that it contributes to water resources, right? So when the Clean Water Act was passed in this country in 1972. This is the main federal piece of legislation that governs the quality of surface waters in the US. Right? There were some aspects of that law that touched on how agriculture should be regulated, but none of those elements of the law mandated or had any specific requirements. For the most part, agriculture was regulated on a voluntary basis. Right? So for many years, while we have made big improvements in other areas of water quality in the US, so for example, in the 1970s, the federal government provided grants to municipalities to help them either build or improve wastewater treatment plants. Right? Those investments that helped municipalities upgrade or build new wastewater treatment plants substantially improved water quality in the US. Right? We had cases where cities would dump raw sewage or poorly treated sewage in streams or rivers. And over the 70s and the 80s, we dramatically improved the quality of treatment of wastewater. Right? However, we put very little emphasis on trying to control pollution from agriculture. And this is runoff from fertilizers, from pesticides that are applied in agriculture. And to this day, agriculture is now probably the top contributor to water pollution in the US. Right? And we start seeing those problems very, very clearly. There is this famous example in Ames, Iowa, where the city of, in Des Moines, Iowa, where the city of Des Moines is sort of downstream of a watershed that has a lot of agricultural activity, and all the effluent from the farms that are upstream of Des Moines is running down, and it affects the reservoir, the water reservoir that Des Moines uses as a source of drinking water. Right? So the water utility in Des Moines is required to spend a lot of money to treat the water that it uses as the drinking water source for the city of Des Moines, because of the increased pollution, the increased number of pollutants that are found in that water from the runoff from all the upstream farms. Right? So there was a famous lawsuit there where the city sued the farmers, the cooperative of farmers upstream, arguing that their actions have a direct impact on the water quality that the city uses as a source of drinking water. So we start seeing a lot of those problems pop up around the country. And the question is, how does one go about providing either incentives for farmers to decrease pollution or mandates, right? Sort of it's the carrot and stick approach. Are we going to use a carrot? Are we going to try to incentivize farmers, or are we going to try to penalize them for contributing to pollution?
So what is the current result of those types of court cases? That I don't know if the law is relatively emerging or if there's always been upstream, downstream legal issues. What is, I mean, does Des Moines win? Is that sufficient to be able to incentivize the change? Yeah.
Yes, I think Des Moines lost in this case. And this goes to show, that it is very hard to put regulations, mandates on an industry like farming that affects many people around the country, an industry that for many years has successfully lobbied against specific mandates, specific requirements for effluent reduction. Right? So there are a lot of programs offered by the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, that try to incentivize farmers, to pays them to take land out of production, pays farmers to implement sort of sustainable farming practices that can have benign effects on water quality, so plant cover crops, or reduce the amount of fertilizers that are used. Right? But all of those things are done for the most part on a voluntary basis. And that is a problem, right? So long as there is no sort of direct mandate for effluent reduction, it's going to be very hard to achieve meaningful improvements in water quality, at least to the extent that agriculture is responsible for affecting water quality.
And so it seems that the federal government does regulate water for consumption. And the localities are largely responsible for funding that, cities, counties, and I assume that's probably state dependent, as well as their own legal infrastructures. But as water quality starts reducing, the localities either they have to improve their infrastructure to filter out the contaminants and thus charge more to build up that infrastructure, or maybe they can get either state or federal grants, incentives, or loans and things like that to be able to pay for it. Is my assumption, which can be pretty costly anyways. Or the other direction is finding ways to generate revenue and disincentivize polluters, right?
Exactly, and different utilities around the country are having, finding different ways to deal with those challenges, right? What's important to consider is that we have hundreds of thousands of water utilities in this country, right? So I'm just going to pull up a little figure here, just that summarizes, gives us a picture of what we're looking at in this country in terms of numbers of water systems. So when we say water systems here, we mean water utilities, right? So here on the left part of this graph, we see on the vertical axis number of utilities in thousands, and on the horizontal axis, how big is that system? How big is that utility? If you look at the first column, here we have 124,000 utilities in the United States, each of them serving fewer than 500 people. These are small, very small utilities in small towns in the US, in rural towns. All of those 124,000 utilities collectively serve about 14 million people in the US, right? A pretty small share of the US population. So here on the graph on the right side, you see number of people served by each system, right? And we can see that almost half the population of the US, 140 million people in the US, get their water from some of the very large utilities. These are utilities that serve over 100,000 people each. There are about 400 of those around the country. So these are like the big cities, utilities in New York City, Los Angeles, in Chicago. But there is a very large number of utilities that have a very small customer base, right? It is very hard for those small utilities to invest, to raise the revenue that is required for them to upgrade their infrastructure, to upgrade their water treatment systems in order to deal with the types of problems we mentioned before in Des Moines, in Iowa, right? So a utility that sees that the reservoir that it uses as a source of drinking water, if it sees that that reservoir starts becoming more and more polluted, it will have to invest in upgrading its water treatment plant, right? And for those small utilities that have a customer base as small as 500 people, it's going to be exceedingly challenging to raise the revenue that's required to make those upgrades and to improve the quality of water they provide. And just to give you a picture of how challenging that is, this is a graph from an academic paper that was published a few years ago showing number of violations by utilities, right? So the federal government has specific requirements for concentrations of different pollutants that appear in the drinking water after it has been treated by utility, right? So utilities treat the water, they test the water after it has been treated, and they are required to report back to the federal government on the results of those tests. And in some cases, utilities fail to meet the thresholds mandated by the federal government, in which case they violate the federal regulation for clean water, which is the Safe Drinking Water Act. That is the piece of federal legislation that mandates, that has the specific rules about how clean the water we drink should be. Notice that there are thousands of violations, and these are total numbers of violations over a very long period of time, over about almost 34 years, right? There are violations pertaining to the lead and copper rule, right? So this would be a violation, an example of a violation that the city of Flint, Michigan dealt with a few years ago when they started seeing elevated levels of lead after they switched water source from the Detroit water system to the Flint River, right, and realized that they were not ready to treat this different water source, and that resulted in increased lead concentrations in the water that citizens of Flint received. But there's a substantial number of violations for other types of pollutants, like total coliform, like disinfectants that are found in the water that are a byproduct of the chemical treatment that utilities undertake. Right? So it is for the most part those sort of small utilities, right? So here we see a trajectory of how those violations play out over time. But for the most part, it is the small utilities that are challenged to meet those federal regulations, exactly because they don't have enough customer base, enough revenue source to upgrade their.
I don't know if you can give us a sense of faith in terms of these numbers. So, Flint, Michigan, obviously has a big impact in both high school student and coaches' understanding of this topic coming in. And my understanding would be that the faith that people place in their utility company measuring lead content adequately and being truthful about that information, their faith in that may be low. So I don't know if you can give me a sense of how these small utilities, medium and large size, and the hundreds of thousands, as you mentioned, how good is that data? And is it self-reported? Do they send in water quality samples and then it's sampled by the EPA or some organization in the federal government? How does that tend to operate?
I mean, that's a great question. So essentially, I guess the question goes to whether or not there is evidence of fraud in reporting of those data, right? So in the case of Flint, Michigan, people have gone to jail. I mean, I think in fact the criminal cases are still ongoing on several Michigan Department of Environmental Quality employees or Genesee County public health employees that were charged as hiding information from the public, right? And instances like that in Flint have severely damaged the relationship between government, local government, and citizens. And that is a problem. I guess.
But if so, I don't know if there is room for additional avenues of improving how these pollutants and heavy metals and things like that are measured. If there's still room for improvement of that. My recollection of at least the texts that I've read around Flint are that the water treatment plant would measure it in certain places. What I'm saying is that the measurement aspect, as it, the new water went through the pipelines and it proved to be more acidic and they were treating it inappropriately and it resulted in lead being released. There were arguments going in different directions on, it's the housing infrastructure that's the problem, not the main distribution network. And it seemed like at least the measurement aspect of it was a part of the problem. Or is your understanding, and we're not a party to any of these lawsuits, so we can't claim full expertise on it, that there was data that was clearly there and it was just hidden?
Oh, it's clear that the data was there, right? I mean, even if you consider not just the cases of lead poisoning, but the problem with Legionnaire's disease, which was another problem that affected Flint as a result of the contaminated water. There were early on, when was it, 2014, 2015, when the switch in the water happened, you started seeing increased incidence of patients with Legionnaire's disease. And the county and the state would not ask for the help of the CDC to come in and investigate why those increased numbers of Legionnaire's disease were coming in, right? So I think in Flint, there were failures of all levels of government, local, regional, state, and federal. And I guess the problem is, what kind of systematic ways can we put in place to prevent future incidents of those kinds of failures, right? Because individuals will always, we will always have cases of individuals that fail to pursue the mandate that they have for their job, right? We will always have cases of individuals behaving fraudulently, and thankfully these are very few cases, right? But somehow in Flint, they kind of cascaded to the point where there was a complete collapse of the types of safety mechanisms that are in place to protect people's health and welfare. And that is a very big problem, and especially with things like the crisis we are going through today, right? The COVID-19 crisis that requires a very strong trusting relationship between the government and citizens, for citizens to follow the suggestions and the recommendations that the government is making, especially in a situation of severe uncertainty, like what we faced with COVID early on, right? I remember when this whole thing started a year ago, we were concerned that COVID was transmitted through surfaces and touching, and we were disinfecting everything. And over time, we realized that, you know what, that's not actually the problem. The problem is airborne transmission, right? So issues of trust are of paramount importance in the area of public health.
So one of the aspects that you cover in the class is policy measures in protecting water. I don't know if there are additional policy measures and examples that you want to provide, that would be relevant to high school students and when they're researching this topic.
Sure. So one big debate that has been happening over the last probably 7 or 8 years is around what we call in the field a piece of regulation that's called the Waters of the US. There has been a very long-standing debate in this country around what classifies as a water of the US. So the Clean Water Act, when it was first voted into law in 1972, it said that it had some specific requirements about water quality in waters of the US, which the law described in a relatively loose and obscure way. Right? It wasn't clear whether, for example, isolated wetlands are classified as waters of the US, right? Whether intermittent streams that don't have running water for the entire year, but only have water, let's say 6 months out of the year in the spring and summer. Are those intermittent streams classified as waters of the US, and therefore do they fall under federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act? So there's been this very, very long-standing debate playing out on, how do we characterize different water bodies as whether or not they require protection under the Clean Water Act. So what the Obama administration did in 2015 is it tried to clarify exactly what classifies as a water of the US, right? So it provided some guidance with respect to, intermittent streams, isolated wetlands are considered waters of the US, and therefore gave some clarity to states and different state agencies in how they can go about regulating water quality. 2017, Trump administration comes in and says, look, this is an overly burdensome regulation. We are going to scale back. We are going to relax that regulation and decrease the number of water bodies that are classified as being under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. Right? And there was a very big debate there on, the justification of why the Trump administration did that. Part of the rationale behind that repeal of the regulation by the Trump administration was that, look, we don't need to have such strict regulations at the federal level, right? Because based on this concept of environmental federalism that says that, look, it should be, as the federal government should sort of take a step back and allow states to come in the forefront and be responsible for regulating natural resources like water quality or like air quality within their jurisdictions, right? So the Trump administration's rule essentially did just that. It relaxed regulations at the federal level and assumed that states would step up and implement policies to safeguard water quality within their jurisdiction. That's a problem, And it is a problem because pollution, water pollution in one state can and very often affects water quality in another state, right? Water bodies know no political boundaries, right? There are rivers that cross several states in this country. So what one state does and the amount of pollution it releases in a specific water body can affect water quality in several other states downstream, right? So this is what economists call a spillover effect, right? So to the extent that what one state does has spillover effects to other states, there is an argument to be made for federal intervention, right? For the federal government to step in and to ensure health and safety and ecosystem health of the entire US, right? Because the federal government can see whether or not those spillovers take place. And in the case of water quality, we have extensive evidence of those kinds of spillovers. So it is very, we cannot just assume that states will safeguard water sources within their jurisdiction, because states do not receive all the benefits from investing in improved water quality, right? Because what one state does affects water quality in another state. So there is an argument to be made there for intervention by the federal government to ensure that all regulations that are implemented at different states take into consideration how policies in one state affect water quality in another state.
So can you give me a sense if the Obama version of WOTUS, or a more expansive interpretation of what falls under waters of the United States, what policy mechanisms then are available to our federal entities to prevent something like nitrogen loading and dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico?
Sure. So under the Clean Water Act, any polluter that wants to discharge a pollutant in a water of the US, in a stream or a river, has to obtain a permit, right? It's called the NIPTIS permit, the National Determination, I forget what the acronym, how the acronym goes. Essentially, every polluter needs to apply to their state agency and say, look, this is how much I want to release. Can I have a permit that authorizes me to release that amount of pollution, right? And to the extent that this release happens in a water body that is regulated under the Clean Water Act, right, the polluter needs to obtain that permit. Okay. There are no NIPTIS permits for agriculture, right? For the most part, those types of permits apply to what we call point sources of pollution. These are industrial plants, paper mills, chemical plants, power plants, right? Any entity that has a specific pipe that releases effluent in a river. So that type of permitting system is the main policy mechanism through which the federal government and state governments regulate water pollution in the US. And the problem is that such permits are not in place for agriculture.
So one of the assumptions that may be built into Americans is the fantasy that the small scale farm still exists. I mean, there are some versions of it, but a lot of agriculture has been accumulated into hundreds of acres, if not, in some instances, 1,000 plus acres. So large farms, right? And so, the argument against this permitting process is going to be, oh, that's a big barrier. That'll be difficult for the farmers to do. What type of response would somebody have to something like that? Is it going to be super difficult? Is the enforcement of this something that is currently possible with contemporary infrastructure, whether that's federal or state, or would that have to be expanded?
So that's a great point. And this is, in fact, one of the justifications that the Trump administration used to repeal the Obama rule, arguing essentially on the cost of compliance, right? So the Trump administration says, look, if you have this expansive view of what classifies as a water of the US, then you are increasing the cost for all those farmers that just want to go about their business, and you are asking them now to start filing permits and applying for permits, and that means monetary cost for them. And that is a valid argument, right? I guess I would offer the counter argument to this, okay? By not doing that, by not asking farmers to consider the impact they have on water quality, we have substantial costs, right? We have substantial costs in ecosystem problems, right? We have dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. We have dead zones in the Chesapeake Bay. Right? We have impairment of water quality in streams. So there are substantial ecosystems and oftentimes health benefits that we face because of those, because of the lack of regulation. So yes, it is true that regulation costs money, absolutely. Right? Very little things in this life come for free, right? But the issue is, do the benefits of the regulation exceed those costs? If that happens, then yes, there is justification for implementing state or federal policy. And I guess one relevant point here, since we started going down the road of talking about benefits and costs.
So as you pull that up, I do have another question. So you identify yourself as being an economist, correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
So some of the literature that may be out there, considering the maybe lack of regulation and lack of interest of maybe pushing significant regulatory action, especially during the past administration, the Trump administration, is like voluntary education programs. And so are there ways to increase the good Samaritan farmer that's out there that voluntarily cuts back on pollution because they have been educated of their involvement as a particular point that causes Gulf dead zones and things like that? Does that work? Or
thank you for asking this question.
Sure.
This is a question I often like to discuss in class. So what I will say is that education is of paramount importance, right? We cannot change things unless we are dealing with an educated public, right? Even if the federal or the state government passes laws, right? If constituents don't believe in those laws cannot be enforced, right? So education is very, very important. That said, education alone will never be enough. My favorite example here is of President Jimmy Carter, when in 1979, we were dealing with the oil crisis in the US, right? And President Carter appeared on TV wearing his cardigan and asking American citizens to turn down their thermostats in order to conserve electricity. Think about how many Americans responded to that kind of appeal to a good Samaritan, right? I would say that not many, right? So we can make as many appeals as we want, right? But unless we, at the same time that we are educating constituents and people and farmers, we are providing them with the right incentives, either in the forms of carrots or sticks, I don't know that we can expect a lot of things to change, especially in the short to medium term. Education is extremely important, but I believe that it has to come hand in hand with appropriate regulation. We see that in many aspects of environmental policy in the US, right? Aspects of air quality, climate change, right? How many of us are trying to decrease our carbon footprint, right? Versus now, let's say we wake up in the morning and the price of gas has increased by 200% because there is now a carbon tax, right? So we need some kind of incentive to respond along with being educated and understanding the risks of climate change. A graphic that's relevant here is this one, right? So this is from another academic paper. And what that paper did is it went through a series of environmental regulations and considered their benefits and their costs, right? So it considered regulations pertaining to surface water, regulations pertaining to drinking water, as well as regulations pertaining to air quality, right? And on this row here, we have what economists call the benefit cost ratio, right? So we consider the benefits of the policy, right? The number of people that will receive improvements in their health because of this policy versus the compliance costs of this policy, right? Notice that for the average regulation that pertains to air quality, the benefit cost ratio is through the roof. This number, 12.36, means that for every $1 of cost we invest towards policies that improve air quality, we are getting $12 of benefits. These policies are a no-brainer. You implement them any day of the week, twice on Sunday. Policies pertaining to drinking water improvements. Again, substantial benefits, right? For every $1 of costs you implement in order to improve drinking water quality, you get almost $5 of benefits. Notice what happens when we talk about improving the quality of surface water. This is exactly what the Clean Water Act does. Here, it seems like we are failing this benefit cost criterion, right? For every $1 in cost that we invest, we only get back 80 cents in benefits. It therefore seems like regulations to improve surface water quality are not welfare maximizing, as economists say. They don't maximize welfare. The problem here is that when we implement surface water regulations, we assume away any health impacts that improvements in water quality might have. Right? We assume that any pollutants that remain in the water will eventually be cleaned up by the drinking water treatment plants before people consume them. Right? So for the most part, what we measure as benefits in surface water regulations are simply recreational benefits, right? If a river is more clean, more people will go swimming, or they will go boating, or they will go fishing, right? These are oftentimes the only things we consider as the benefits of improving water quality of surface waters. And that's why oftentimes those regulations appear as if they have a very, very low benefit cost ratio.
Why is that the case?
That's the case exactly because we usually never count the health benefits of improving water quality. Right? Exactly because we assume that regardless of how polluted a water body is, there is always some water treatment plant from a utility that will take care of that pollution. And it will remove all the pollutants and provide people with safe drinking water.
So that cost benefit analysis would include the costs associated with those plants, but not maybe a failure to clean it up and the impacts that it has on bodies.
It would not. That regulation would only count the costs to the farmers from reducing pollution to a water body. And because the benefits would not include health benefits, it seems as if the cost of reducing pollution is too high.
So my assumption is if high school students listen to this and they go out and they do research on ways of modifying cost benefit analysis in the context of water regulations, they may find some literature that advocates for those changes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there is, and in fact, the Environmental Protection Agency has an ongoing effort to try to improve the types of models that are used in order to calculate benefits from regulations to improve water quality. There is a large amount of literature towards that end, and I'm happy to point you to specific examples.
So in all likelihood, somebody listening to this who has debated before or coaches, they know about something like the social cost of carbon. Is there a similar term relative to the health cost of water pollution?
You have just put your finger on what water economists are working on as we speak, right? So that what is in the frontier of water economics, of water policy and economics, is an effort to develop a social cost of water. Just like we have a social cost of carbon, we need to develop a social cost of water.
The United States doesn't have that. Do other entities have it internationally?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
But we definitely not have that in the US. And we absolutely need to develop a measure like the social cost of water that incorporates all of the benefits of improving water quality, the same way we have a social cost of carbon that, in theory, includes all of the benefits of reducing CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions.
So, Nikos, I love these interviews because I honestly become a student and learn a lot. We're about to run out of time here. Is there anything else, last thought or concepts or anything else that you think should be included that these high school students should know about?
I guess as somebody that sits in the state of Indiana, where we often don't think about issues of water scarcity, at least to the same extent that somebody sitting in the state of California might be thinking about issues of water scarcity. What I often try to communicate to students is that water availability and water quality are often interlinked, right? We are lucky to be in the state of Indiana that is water rich, right? We don't have cases of water shortages for the most part, yet we have non-trivial issues with water pollution, right? Because of all of the farming activity we have in this state, right? And a day will come, and the example I gave earlier of Des Moines, Iowa, is an example of a state that is currently facing those challenges, right? Where water quality is affecting water availability and vice versa. So those things are often interrelated. The fact that we do live in a water-rich state doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned about issues of water availability and water quality.
And not to mention that some anti-science jurisdictions, so the small water jurisdictions that you mentioned, I think it was Spencer, Indiana, recently removed the fluoridation of their water. So there are barriers that continue to persist that make these policy decisions even harder than they should be.
And there's uncertainty, right? There is, oftentimes there is a lot of uncertainty, right? Right now we have specific thresholds for what we believe is a safety measure for specific pollutants. A few years down the road, we will realize that this threshold is not enough to guarantee safety. I would argue that there should be a zero threshold for lead concentration. There is no safe level for lead concentration in water. Right now, we allow some amount of lead in water. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe in 10 years, we'll find out that that was a very bad idea.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian.